everyone, my name is Mini Sethi. I hope you all are staying healthy. Today we are going to talk about partial, general, static and dynamic equilibrium. First of all, we are going to talk about partial equilibrium. Partial equilibrium is given by Alfred Marshall. That's why it is also called Marshallian equilibrium. Partial equilibrium consider only one market at a time and assuming all other markets are constant. Partial equilibrium consider only one market at a time and assuming all other markets are constant, or we can say that partial equilibrium study about behavior of consumer, firm and market in isolation. For example, partial equilibrium shows prices of Samsung only based on demand and supply of Samsung and assuming demand and supply of other brands like LG, Nokia and Apple are constant. But in reality, prices of Samsung are influenced by LG, Nokia and Apple. But in partial equilibrium, we consider only one market at a time and assuming all other markets are constant. Microeconomic analyses are based on partial equilibrium. As we know, microeconomic analysis focus on smaller part of economy. Microeconomic analysis focus on smaller part of economy. Similar, partial equilibrium focus on smaller part of economy. So we can say that microeconomic analyses are based on partial equilibrium. Partial equilibrium study about equilibrium position of individual firm, consumer and market rather than entire economy. Partial equilibrium assume other things remain constant because at a time it focus on only one thing. Partial equilibrium make concept very simple by ignoring interdependence and interconnection between market. For example, in order to make it very simple, partial equilibrium shows prices of Samsung only based on demand and supply of Samsung and ignore interdependence and interconnection of Samsung with other brands. Now we will see general equilibrium. General equilibrium is given by Leon Walras. That's why it is also known as a Walrasian equilibrium. General equilibrium simultaneously consider equilibrium in all markets. General equilibrium simultaneously consider equilibrium in all markets. That means general equilibrium consider how one market can affect other market, or we can say that general equilibrium explain interdependence and interconnection among markets. General equilibrium don't assume anything is constant. Macroeconomic analyses are based on general equilibrium. As we know, macroeconomic analysis focus on large part of economy and overall performance of economy. Similar, general equilibrium focus on large part of economy and overall performance of economy. For example, general equilibrium simultaneously study about demand and supply of Samsung, Nokia, LG and Apple and come to conclusion as a aggregate demand and aggregate supply. Aggregate demand means demand of all and aggregate supply means supply of all. So we can say that general equilibrium simultaneously consider equilibrium in all market. Now we will see static equilibrium. Static equilibrium is a state where economic variables are constant. Static equilibrium is a state where economic variables are constant. That means key economic variables like price, quantities, income are not fluctuating, they are constant. For example, we can see static equilibrium when demand and supply are balanced. Static equilibrium divided into four parts: microstatic, macrostatic, microcomparative static, macrocomparative static. Microstatic shows balance between micro variable. For example, microstatic shows balance between individual demand and individual supply. At each point you can see individual demand and supply are balanced. And macrostatic shows balance between macro variable. For example, macrostatic shows balance between aggregate demand and aggregate supply. At each point you can see aggregate demand and supply are balanced. Now we will see microcomparative static. Microcomparative static compare new equilibrium with old equilibrium without explaining a transition path. That means it just compare E1 equilibrium with E equilibrium, but it will not explain how we can reach from this E point to E1 point. For example, it just tell us at E equilibrium point prices are OP and demand is OQ. At E1 point prices are OP1 and demand is OQ1, but it will not explain how we can reach from E point to E1 point. So we can say that micro comparative static compare new equilibrium with old equilibrium without explaining transition path. And macro comparative static also compare new equilibrium with old equilibrium without explaining transaction path at macro level. Here you can see we have aggregate supply, aggregate demand and aggregate demand. It explain at E equilibrium income is OY, at E1 equilibrium income is OY1, but it will not explain how we can reach from this E point to E1 point. Now we'll say dynamic equilibrium. Dynamic equilibrium involves a continuous change in economic variables like price, quantities and income. That means it explains economic variables like price, quantities, income are continuous changing due to some factors. And dynamic equilibrium divided into two parts, microdynamic and macrodynamic. First of all, we will see microdynamic. Microdynamic explain where micro variables are continuous changing but overall system will remain stable. As we know, when variables are continuous changing, we will lose our old equilibrium. That's why microdynamic explain entire process of adjustment between breakup of old equilibrium and formation of a new equilibrium. Please listen carefully. Microdynamic explain entire process of adjustment between breakup of old equilibrium and formation of new equilibrium. Here you can see our old equilibrium is E. Our original old equilibrium is E and old prices, or we can say original prices, are OP. Now suppose due to any reason we will lose our this original equilibrium. Now we are here and prices are P1. And microdynamic will explain whole process how we can reach from this B point to E point. Sometime it is possible we can achieve our old equilibrium, but sometime we are not. But this microdynamic will explain whole process how we can move from one equilibrium point to other equilibrium point. For example, it will explain how we can move from B to C, C to D, D to E, or E to F, F to G. Eventually we will achieve our equilibrium point E. Now we will see macrodynamic. Microdynamic explain micro variables are continuous changing, fluctuating, but macrodynamic shows macro variables are continuous changing, fluctuating. It also shows adjustment process between breakup of old equilibrium and formation of a new equilibrium. That means it clearly explains how we can reach from this E point to E1 point. Initial equilibrium point is E, initial income is OY. Now suppose investment increase. As investment increase, output increase, employment increase, eventually income also increase from Y to Y1, and we have reached from this E point to E1 point. Entire process is explained by macrodynamic. So this is all about equilibrium. I think you got it, and thank you so much for watching this video. Bye, take care.